On the morning of October 9, 1942, Private First Class Tadashi Ikeda crouched in a shallow foxhole on the edge of a coconut grove on Guadalcanal and listened to a sound he had never heard before. He had heard bombs. Bombs fell from aircraft you could see. They made a descending whistle, a rising pitch that told your body something was coming. There was a fraction of a second between the sound and the impact. A fraction of a second where your brain registered what was about to happen. He had heard machine gun fire. It had a rhythm to it, a mechanical, almost predictable cadence that your mind could track, could orient toward, could mentally place on a map of the landscape. He had heard mortars. They popped from somewhere behind enemy lines, traced an arc through the air that experienced soldiers could sometimes watch, sometimes even predict where they would land. What he heard on the morning of October 9th was different. It started as a distant concussion. Not a sound exactly, more of a pressure change in the air, a slight thickening, then a rushing, tearing sound overhead. Not a whistle, not a pitch you could track. A sound more like fabric being ripped apart at enormous speed, directly above him and then almost simultaneously, before his mind had time to process what he had heard. The ground 30 meters to his right simply ceased to exist. Not an explosion. Not the way he understood explosions. The ground disappeared. It was replaced by a column of black earth and smoke that rose 15 meters into the air, and the concussion arrived a fraction of a second later and knocked him sideways in his foxhole. Then it happened again. 15 meters closer. Then again. Ikeda understood in those seconds something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The shells were walking toward him, systematically, methodically, with a precision that felt almost deliberate, almost personal, as if whoever was firing knew exactly where he was and was simply adjusting their aim. He ran. Every instinct he had, every fiber of training the Imperial Japanese Army had given him, was overridden by something older and more fundamental. Something that lives in the part of the human brain that was already ancient when the first armies marched. He ran because staying meant dying, and he knew it with a certainty that his conscious mind had no part in reaching. He survived that morning. Many of his comrades did not. In interviews conducted by American intelligence officers after the war, Ikeda said something that surprised his questioners. He had faced American flamethrowers. He had endured naval bombardment from battleships. He had been strafed by fighter aircraft. He had survived artillery barrages that lasted for days. He said the artillery was the worst. Not because it killed the most men, though it did. Not because the wounds it caused were the most severe, though they were. But because of something else entirely. Because of what it did to the mind before it did anything to the body. Because artillery gave you just enough time to know it was coming, and not enough time to do anything about it. This is the story of how American artillery broke Japanese infantry across the Pacific War. Not all at once, not easily, but systematically, over 4 years of combat, through a combination of technology, doctrine, and a fundamental psychological truth about human beings under fire. To understand why artillery terrified Japanese soldiers in a way that other weapons did not, you have to first understand what Japanese soldiers had been told to expect. The Imperial Japanese Army had been fighting since 1931. By the time Japan went to war with the United States in December 1941, many Japanese soldiers had more than a decade of combat experience in China and Manchuria. They were not inexperienced. They were not naive about the realities of modern warfare. But their combat experience had been shaped by a specific context. Fighting in China had given Japanese soldiers enormous confidence. Chinese nationalist forces were often poorly equipped, inconsistently supplied, and unevenly trained. Japanese infantry routinely overcame numerically superior Chinese forces through superior training, discipline, and unit cohesion. Japanese soldiers learned that courage and determination could overcome material disadvantage. They were taught this. They believed it. They had evidence for it. The artillery they had faced in China was often outdated, poorly maintained, and inadequately supplied with ammunition. Chinese artillery sometimes fired so few shells per engagement that Japanese infantry could advance through the barrage with acceptable casualties. The lesson Japanese soldiers absorbed was that Western-style firepower could be overcome by the fighting spirit of the individual soldier. This belief was not irrational. It was based on genuine experience. It was simply about to become catastrophically wrong. American industrial capacity in 1942 was producing artillery ammunition at rates the Japanese military had never contemplated. By 1943, American factories were manufacturing more artillery shells every month than Japan produced in an entire year. By 1944, the disparity had grown so extreme that American artillery officers were occasionally told to reduce the rate of fire because resupply ships couldn't keep pace with consumption. Japanese soldiers trained to overcome Chinese artillery through spirit and determination were about to encounter something qualitatively different. Something that spirit and determination had no answer for. To understand the psychological effect of American artillery on Japanese infantry, you need to understand something that military historians often overlook when they focus on casualty figures and territorial gains. There is a fundamental difference between knowing intellectually that something can kill you and experiencing the specific, visceral, embodied terror of artillery fire. That difference explains why Japanese veterans, interviewed decades later, consistently described artillery as the weapon that had broken them. Not flamethrowers, not naval bombardment, not aerial bombing, but artillery. The reasons are specific, technical, and deeply human. The first reason is sound. Artillery shells fired from American 105mm and 155mm howitzers traveled at velocities between 470 and 680 meters per second, depending on the propellant charge and the specific weapon. This meant that a shell fired from a battery 5 kilometers away would arrive at its target approximately 8 seconds after firing. 8 seconds sounds like enough time to react. It is not. The shell was supersonic for much of its flight. The first sound a soldier in its target zone would hear was not the distant boom of the firing weapon. It was the tearing, rushing sound of the shell's passage through the air immediately overhead. By the time that sound registered, the shell was already past him or already landing within meters of his position. Bombs dropped from aircraft gave soldiers a warning period. The aircraft was visible. The bomb's descent was trackable. Experienced soldiers learned to gauge the angle of fall and estimate where the bomb would land. They had, in the best case, 3 to 5 seconds of warning from the moment the bomb became visible to impact. Flamethrowers required an operator to close within 40 yards. The threat was visible, personal, and directional. A soldier in a fortified position could watch a flamethrower team approach. He could direct fire at them. He could close shutters on firing ports. He had agency. Terrible, limited, inadequate agency, but agency nonetheless. Artillery offered nothing of the kind. The shell arrived before the soldier could process what he was hearing. Impact and awareness arrived almost simultaneously. There was no time to flatten out, no time to change position, no time to warn a comrade. There was only the sound and then, if you survived, the shock. Captain Noboru Washi commanded an infantry company of the 124th Infantry Regiment during the fighting on New Georgia Island in the Solomon Islands in the summer of 1943. He survived the campaign and was eventually taken prisoner in 1945 during the fighting in the Philippines. American intelligence officers interviewed him extensively after the war. Washi said that he had lost more men to American artillery than to any other cause. But he was careful to distinguish between the statistical fact and the psychological effect. He said his men could endure high casualties from artillery as long as the shelling was intermittent. As long as there were gaps. As long as they could move, could recover their wounded, could reorient, could maintain the belief that action was possible. What they could not endure, he said, was sustained fire. Fire that continued without gaps for hours. Fire that followed them when they moved. Fire that found them even when they believed they had found cover. He described an engagement in August 1943 where his company was caught in the open during a river crossing by concentrated American artillery fire. The shelling lasted 11 minutes. When it ended, he had lost 43 men. Not to a single concentrated strike, but to a systematic destruction that moved across his company's position in overlapping patterns. He said that after 4 minutes of sustained fire, men in his company began to behave in ways he had never seen before. Experienced soldiers. Men who had been under fire in China for years. They began to abandon their equipment. They began to move randomly, not toward cover, not toward enemy positions, but simply to move. To be somewhere other than where they were. He said the movement was irrational. Moving increased their exposure to fragments. Staying in shallow cover, however inadequate, was statistically safer than running across open ground. He knew this. They knew this. They ran anyway. This is what sustained artillery fire does to the human nervous system. It does not simply kill. It systematically dismantles the capacity for rational decision-making through a mechanism that neuroscience has only recently begun to fully understand. The human nervous system processes threat through two parallel systems. The first is the cortical system, the thinking brain, which evaluates threats rationally, considers options, and selects responses based on trained behavior and conscious judgment. The second is the subcortical system, the ancient, automatic, preconscious survival mechanism that triggers before conscious thought can intervene. Under moderate threat, the cortical system remains in control. Training works. Discipline holds. Soldiers do what they have been trained to do. Under sustained, unpredictable, apparently omnidirectional threat, the subcortical system begins to override cortical control. This is not weakness. It is not cowardice. It is a fundamental feature of how the human nervous system is built. The subcortical system evolved over millions of years to keep animals alive under lethal threat. It is very good at its job. Artillery exploits this system with a precision that no other conventional weapon matches. The key elements are unpredictability and persistence. A bomb is a discrete event. Falls, it explodes, it is over. A flamethrower attack is visible, directional, finite. A sniper round arrives without warning but kills individuals, not groups, and the threat can be localized. An artillery barrage is none of these things. It is multiple, it is sustained, it is spatially distributed, and it is apparently random from the perspective of any individual soldier in the target zone. Even when artillery fire is methodically walked across an area in a predictable pattern, as American observers and fire control parties were trained to do, the individual soldier experiencing the barrage cannot perceive the pattern. He experiences only randomness. The human brain handles random threat very poorly. When threat is random and persistent, the nervous system cannot habituate to it. There is no gap in which the cortical system can reestablish control. The subcortical system remains activated at maximum intensity for the duration of the barrage. If the barrage lasts long enough, the nervous system begins to fail. Concentration collapses. Memory for immediate events becomes unreliable. Motor control degrades. Decision-making becomes erratic. In extreme cases, soldiers enter a dissociative state in which they are functionally incapable of organized resistance. American artillery doctrine in the Pacific, developed through combat experience from Guadalcanal through Okinawa, was designed, whether its designers knew the neurological reasons or not, to exploit exactly these vulnerabilities. On August 7, 1942, the 1st Marine Division landed on Guadalcanal. They brought with them 11 batteries of artillery organized into the 11th Marines Regiment. Their primary weapons were the M1A1 75mm pack howitzer and the M1 105mm howitzer. The 75mm pack howitzer was a weapon designed for mobility. It could be broken down into components and carried by pack animals or manhandled by infantry across terrain that wheeled vehicles could not negotiate. It weighed 653 pounds assembled and fired a 14.7-pound shell to a maximum range of 8,925 meters. The 105mm howitzer was the backbone of American divisional artillery. It weighed 4,980 pounds and required a wheeled carriage towed by a truck or half-track. It fired a 33-pound shell to a maximum range of 11,160 meters. A trained crew could fire 3 rounds per minute sustained for extended periods. These weapons were good. But weapons alone do not determine effectiveness. Doctrine determines effectiveness. And American artillery doctrine in 1942 was about to undergo a transformation that would make it qualitatively different from anything Japanese soldiers had faced before. The critical development was the Fire Direction Center, or FDC. Before the Second World War, artillery doctrine in most armies called for individual batteries to operate semi-independently. Each battery had its own observers, its own communication, and its own fire control. Concentrating fire from multiple batteries on a single target required coordination between battery commanders that was slow, prone to communication failures, and difficult to execute under the stress of combat. The American Army's Field Artillery School at Fort Sill, Oklahoma had been developing a centralized fire direction concept throughout the 1930s. The idea was simple in concept and extraordinarily complex in execution. All batteries in an artillery battalion would be tied into a single fire direction center. The FDC would receive all requests for fire, calculate firing data for all batteries simultaneously, and coordinate massed fires from multiple batteries on single targets. The practical effect was that instead of a platoon commander being able to call for one battery of 4 guns, he could call for an entire battalion of 12 guns. Instead of receiving 30 or 40 shells on a target over several minutes as individual batteries worked through their own fire control procedures, he could receive 100 shells on a target in 60 seconds as 12 guns fired simultaneously on the same firing data. The Japanese had no equivalent system. Japanese artillery doctrine called for artillery to support infantry through direct fire when possible, or through individually coordinated indirect fire missions. The concept of massed, centrally directed fires from multiple batteries on a single infantry target was largely absent from Japanese practice at the beginning of the Pacific War. This disparity meant that when Japanese infantry encountered American artillery for the first time in sustained combat, they were encountering a qualitatively different kind of weapon than anything their training had prepared them for. Sergeant Major Kenji Matsumoto served as an artillery observer with the Japanese 17th Army on Guadalcanal in late 1942. He had been trained in artillery observation and fire control in Japan and had served in China before the Pacific War. He understood artillery. He knew how it worked. This knowledge made his experience on Guadalcanal worse, not better. Matsumoto observed American artillery techniques during the fighting around Henderson Field in October 1942. He watched American infantry calling for fire, watched the shells arrive, and calculated in his head what he was seeing. He estimated that American artillery units were achieving a rate of concentrated fire on target that Japanese artillery could not match even with twice the number of guns. He wrote in his diary, a diary that survived the war and was captured and translated by American intelligence, that the Americans seemed to use their artillery as infantry used machine guns, not as a precision weapon delivering carefully aimed rounds at identified targets, but as an area weapon delivering a weight of fire that made entire zones lethal. He wrote that Japanese infantry was trained to endure enemy fire and close with the enemy regardless of casualties. He had seen his men do this against Chinese artillery, against naval gunfire, against aerial bombing. He had watched them absorb punishment that should have broken any unit and continue fighting. But he wrote that there was something different about massed American artillery that he struggled to find words for. He wrote that it seemed to remove the possibility of action, not just kill men. Remove the possibility of doing anything. He wrote that men who survived a sustained American artillery preparation emerged from their positions not ready to fight but simply present. Alive but not functional. Unable to organize, unable to communicate, unable to resist effectively. He struggled to explain this in military terms. He was writing in 1942. The neurological explanation would not come for decades. What he was observing was the systematic, involuntary shutdown of organized human cognition under sustained, unpredictable threat. He had no framework for understanding it. He only knew what he saw. The artillery doctrine the Americans brought to the Pacific had 2 elements that Japanese soldiers found particularly difficult to cope with. The first was massed fires. The second was the forward observer system. American artillery units assigned forward observers to infantry companies. These were trained artillery officers or non-commissioned officers who moved with the infantry, maintained radio contact with the fire direction center, and could call for and adjust artillery fire in real time from positions close enough to observe the effects of each round. The implications were profound. A Japanese infantry unit that believed it had found cover, that had moved to a position the Americans could not observe, that had successfully evaded American patrols and occupied what looked like a defensible position, might find itself under accurate artillery fire within minutes of arriving. Not because the Americans had guessed where they were, because an observer with a radio had watched them move. The perception that there was no safe ground, no position that could not be found and engaged with accurate, massed fire, was psychologically devastating in ways that exceeded the physical casualties inflicted. Corporal Hiroshi Takahara served with the 4th Infantry Regiment during the fighting on Bougainville in 1943 and 1944. He was captured in 1944 and interviewed by American intelligence. He described what it was like to be in a unit that had been located by American observers. He said that his unit had moved at night across several kilometers of jungle to occupy a new position. They believed they had not been observed. They arrived before dawn, began digging in, established fields of fire. They had done everything their training required. At approximately 7 a.m., before his unit had completed its defensive preparations, American artillery fire began falling on their position. The first rounds were not accurate. They were ranging shots. But within 4 adjustments, within perhaps 3 minutes, the fire was accurate and sustained. He said that men who had marched all night, who believed they had successfully evaded the Americans, who had just begun to feel the first cautious belief that they might be safe, lost something fundamental in those 3 minutes. He said the understanding that they could be found anywhere, that movement itself didn't offer safety, that the Americans seemed to know where they were regardless of what they did, produced a kind of despair that bullets and bombs did not. He used a word in Japanese that his interpreter translated as hopelessness. Not fear exactly, not panic, something deeper, the cessation of belief that action could change outcomes. This is one of the most significant psychological effects of effective artillery, and it operated on a different mechanism than the terror of flamethrowers or the visceral shock of bombing. On November 23, 1943, 2nd Lieutenant Keith Garfield Morrison crouched in a shell crater on Bidio Island in the Tarawa Atoll and held a radio handset to his ear. Morrison was 23 years old, from Provo, Utah. He had graduated from the University of Utah in June 1942 and received his commission through the Army's Officer Candidate School at Fort Sill. He had never been under fire before November 20, 1943. 3 days into the battle for Tarawa, he had been under almost continuous fire for 70 hours. His assignment was forward observer for the 1st Battalion, 10th Marines. His job was to watch where Japanese fire was coming from, identify targets, call coordinates to the Fire Direction Center, observe the impact of incoming rounds, and adjust fire until shells were landing where they needed to land. The work was technical, and it required him to remain functional under conditions designed to make human beings cease to function. He had to watch, calculate, communicate, and adjust while Japanese machine guns, mortars, and rifle fire tried to kill him specifically, because observers with radios were as high priority a target for Japanese defenders as flamethrower operators. A raised radio antenna marked a forward observer the same way a flamethrower tank marked its operator. Japanese snipers were trained to look for them. Morrison worked through 3 separate radio operators during the 3-day battle. The first was killed in the first 12 hours. The second was wounded seriously enough that he could no longer operate the equipment. The third stayed with Morrison until the end of the battle. Morrison himself was wounded twice, once by shrapnel from a Japanese mortar on the 2nd day, and once by a bullet that grazed his left arm on the 3rd. He kept working. The fires he called contributed to the destruction of multiple Japanese defensive positions, including a blockhouse on the western end of Bidio that had survived direct naval gunfire from battleships because its concrete walls were 4 feet thick. Morrison directed a sustained fire mission against the structure's firing ports and ventilation openings. The rounds didn't destroy the concrete. They killed the men inside through overpressure and fragments entering through every aperture. After the battle, Marine officers debriefed him extensively. They wanted to understand what he had observed about Japanese defensive behavior under artillery fire. What he described aligned with what infantry officers had been observing across multiple Pacific battles. Japanese defenders in fortified positions could sustain artillery fire for extended periods. Their concrete and log structures were designed to do exactly that. But Japanese infantry in the open, caught in the killing zones between fortified positions, or attempting to counterattack across open ground, broke under sustained American artillery at a consistency that surprised even the Marines who were calling the fire. Morrison described watching a Japanese counterattack on the night of November 21st. A significant force of Japanese infantry, he estimated 200 or more men, moved from the eastern end of Bidio toward American lines. He had the radio. He had coordinates. He called for fire. He said the counterattack simply stopped. Not stopped and took cover. Stopped as an organized military formation. Within 5 minutes of the first round's landing, the formation had ceased to exist as a coherent unit. Some men continued to advance. Some men ran. Some men disappeared into whatever cover the flat coral atoll offered. He said the survivors who made it to marine lines were not fighting effectively. They were individuals. They had lost the organizational structure that made a military unit something more dangerous than a collection of armed men. He said this quietly, in the measured language of a professional soldier assessing a tactical situation. But the implications of what he described were profound. Artillery had done something to that formation that no other weapon could have accomplished in the same time frame. It had not simply killed men. It had destroyed the organizational architecture that allowed those men to function as a military unit. The forward observer system gave American artillery something Japanese artillery largely lacked in the Pacific: the ability to respond quickly and accurately to developing tactical situations. A Japanese infantry unit attempting a counterattack, moving across open ground, crossing a stream, occupying a new position, was visible to American observers for the minutes required to close with American lines. Those minutes were often enough. An experienced forward observer could call for fire, receive the first rounds within 90 seconds, and begin adjusting onto target within 3 or 4 minutes of identifying the threat. By the time Japanese infantry had crossed 200 meters of open ground, American shells were often already landing in their path. This capability had a secondary psychological effect beyond the direct casualties it caused. Japanese commanders began to treat movement in daylight as inherently suicidal. Units that needed to reposition, resupply, reinforce, or evacuate casualties were forced to do so at night, under conditions that degraded their effectiveness and their morale. The constraint on movement compressed Japanese tactical options. Units that could not move freely could not concentrate at points of weakness in American lines. Units that could not resupply adequately began to experience the degradation in physical condition that compounded the psychological effects of artillery. A soldier who is hungry, thirsty, sleep-deprived, and operating under sustained stress is less resistant to the psychological effects of artillery than a soldier who is rested and supplied. The American ability to interdict Japanese supply and movement with artillery fire created a downward spiral in Japanese defensive capacity that went beyond the direct effects of any individual fire mission. Sergeant Yoshio Kanda was a squad leader with the 29th Infantry Division during the fighting on Saipan in June and July 1944. He survived the campaign and was captured in July 1944. He was one of relatively few Japanese prisoners taken during the Mariana Islands campaign, and American intelligence debriefed him extensively. Kanda said that his unit had not received adequate water for 6 days before their position was overrun. They had not been resupplied with ammunition for 8 days. They had been unable to evacuate their wounded because any movement during daylight drew artillery fire within minutes. He described the psychological state of his unit in the days before their position fell. He said men who had been reliable, disciplined soldiers were making decisions he could not explain. Men were abandoning positions without orders. Men were firing at sounds in the night that turned out to be nothing. Men were refusing to eat the food they had, though they were hungry, because the act of eating required more psychological energy than they had available. He said this last thing carefully, as if he was not certain his interpreter would understand what he meant. He said men were alive but not functioning, present but not available, as if the sustained stress had consumed some resource that they could not replenish. He was describing, with extraordinary precision, the clinical symptoms of acute stress response and the beginnings of what would later be classified as combat stress reaction. He had no clinical language for it. He only knew what he had watched happen to his soldiers. He said the artillery had done it. Not the casualties the artillery caused. The artillery itself. The sustained, unrelenting, apparently random threat that followed them wherever they went and never stopped. American artillery had been enormously effective in the European theater of operations as well. German veterans described their fear of American artillery in terms similar to those used by Japanese veterans. The fear of being caught in the open under American fire, the awareness that the fire direction system could concentrate an overwhelming weight of shells on any identified target within minutes, was a common thread in German after-action reports and veteran accounts. But the Pacific presented specific conditions that made American artillery even more psychologically effective against Japanese infantry than it was against German infantry. The first condition was the geography of island warfare. European campaigns were fought across vast continental distances. Units in trouble had room to retreat, to disperse, to find terrain that limited the effectiveness of artillery. A German battalion under intense artillery fire in France could, in many situations, fall back 10 kilometers to prepared positions in rear areas where the immediate threat was reduced and the unit could reconstitute. Japanese units defending Pacific Islands had no such option. The islands were small. Retreat meant retreat toward the water. On an island 8 square miles in size, a unit under artillery fire was always within range of every American artillery piece on the island. There was no rear area. There was no safe ground behind the immediate front. This geographic confinement amplified the psychological effects of artillery in ways that the same intensity of fire could not replicate in a continental campaign. A German soldier under heavy artillery fire experienced terror, experienced the neurological effects of sustained threat, experienced the degradation of cognitive function. But he carried in the back of his mind the knowledge that there was ground beyond the immediate killing zone. That movement was possible. That survival through withdrawal was a real option. A Japanese soldier defending a Pacific island carried no such knowledge. He had nowhere to go. The fire that was killing his comrades was the same fire that would kill him wherever he moved within the island's boundaries. The hopelessness that Corporal Takahara had described, that specific despair that was different from ordinary fear, was in part a rational response to a genuine geographic reality. The second condition was the relationship between American artillery and American sea power. In Europe, artillery units were limited in the weight of fire they could sustain by the logistics of resupply over land lines of communication. Shell consumption could exceed resupply rates, and artillery units sometimes ran short of ammunition at critical moments. In the Pacific, American artillery units were resupplied by sea. Ships could deliver more ammunition than land transport could in most operational contexts. American logistics in the Pacific, though consistently challenged by the vast distances involved, were generally sufficient to maintain ammunition supply at the rate American artillery consumed it. This meant that the sustained fires that broke Japanese infantry were not theoretical. They were consistently executable. A Japanese unit that had learned to endure 2 hours of preliminary bombardment before an American assault discovered that American forces could, when they chose to, sustain preliminary bombardment for 6 hours or 12 or more. The ability to sustain fire longer than the enemy could psychologically endure was not a matter of tactical cleverness. It was a matter of industrial capacity. American factories were producing artillery ammunition faster than Japanese soldiers could learn to cope with it. The third condition that made American artillery particularly effective in the Pacific was the specific nature of Japanese defensive tactics. Lieutenant General Kurabayashi's defensive doctrine on Iwo Jima, which centered on deep fortifications, tunnel systems, and prepared fields of fire, was the most sophisticated expression of a defensive approach that Japanese commanders had been developing since Guadalcanal. The doctrine explicitly acknowledged that Japanese forces could not match American firepower in the open. It attempted to negate American firepower advantages by putting Japanese soldiers underground. This doctrine was highly effective against aerial bombing and naval gunfire. Concrete and earth provided genuine protection against those weapons when the fortifications were deep enough. But the doctrine had a critical vulnerability. It could only protect soldiers who were inside the fortifications. Japanese infantry doctrine required, at various points during a defense, for soldiers to occupy fighting positions in the open. They had to man the machine gun positions that covered the approaches to the fortifications. They had to move between positions to reinforce threatened sectors. They had to counterattack when American infantry penetrated the defensive line. They had to manage wounded men and resupply operations. All of these activities required movement in the open. And movement in the open, in the presence of American forward observers with radios, invited immediate and devastating artillery response. The deeper Japanese soldiers buried themselves to escape American firepower, the more catastrophic the artillery effect was when they were finally forced into the open. Units that had spent days in tunnels and bunkers, emerging only at night for essential activities, were in a state of psychological and physical degradation that made them particularly vulnerable to the shock of encountering concentrated artillery fire. Colonel James Risley commanded the 6th Marine Regiment during the fighting on Saipan in June 1944. He described in his after-action report the effect of artillery preparation on Japanese counterattacks. He noted a consistent pattern. Japanese infantry that conducted counterattacks across ground that had not been subjected to recent artillery fire was capable of organized, aggressive, and sometimes tactically sophisticated action. Japanese infantry that was forced to counterattack across ground that American forward observers could observe and bring fire on broke consistently, regardless of the quality of the units involved. The break was not always immediate. Sometimes units maintained cohesion through the first minutes of a fire mission and continued to advance. But if the fire continued, if the adjustment was accurate, if rounds continued to land in and among the advancing formation for 4 or 5 minutes, the formation would cease to function as an organized unit before it closed with American lines. Risley wrote this in the dry language of a military after-action report, focused on tactical implications and lessons learned for future operations. He was not attempting to analyze the psychological mechanisms involved. He was simply reporting what he had consistently observed. What he was reporting was the systematic destruction of the cognitive architecture that allows military units to function under fire. Private First Class Saburo Hayashi was 19 years old when he landed on Peleliu with the Japanese 14th Infantry Division in September 1944. He had been in the Imperial Japanese Army for less than a year. He had been told, as all Japanese soldiers were told, that American soldiers were inferior in spirit and determination, that their reliance on firepower was a substitute for the fighting qualities that Japanese infantry possessed by nature and by training. He had been told this. He had believed it. Within 48 hours of landing on Peleliu, Hayashi had revised his beliefs entirely. The preliminary naval and aerial bombardment that preceded the American landing on Peleliu on September 15 had been massive. American commanders had estimated it would eliminate Japanese defensive capacity. It had not. The Japanese 14th Infantry Division's fortifications in the Ymerbergal ridges had survived the bombardment largely intact, and the subsequent Marine landing encountered fierce resistance. But what Hayashi experienced in the days that followed the landing was not the naval bombardment. Naval shells arrived in patterns that could, with experience, be partially anticipated. The guns were on ships. The ships' positions were fixed or limited. Even very heavy naval fire had a quality that his mind could orient toward. The artillery that the Americans brought ashore was different. Within 24 hours of the landing, American artillery was operational on the beachhead. Within 48 hours, forward observers were moving with Marine infantry throughout the operational area. Within 72 hours, there was no position Hayashi's unit occupied that could not be reached by accurate, sustained American artillery fire. He described this in an account recorded by American intelligence several months later, after he was captured during the fighting in the Philippines. He said that the artillery had created a condition that he found very difficult to explain in ordinary language. He said it had created a world where action did not have predictable consequences. In normal experience, he said, a soldier does things and the things produce results. You dig a hole and the hole provides cover. You move from one position to another and the movement takes you away from the danger. You stay still and the stillness makes you harder to detect. Under sustained American artillery, he said, none of these things remained reliable. You could dig the deepest hole your tools allowed, and a round could land in it. You could move to a position that appeared safe, and artillery would find you within minutes. You could stay perfectly still and a round could land beside you as if the Americans had been waiting for exactly that moment. He said the result was not simply fear. It was a more fundamental disruption. He said his mind began to have difficulty assigning meaning to his own actions. He knew, in an abstract way, that some things were statistically safer than other things. But the connection between knowing that and feeling able to act on it had been severed. He said this quietly, in the manner of someone describing a medical condition rather than a military experience. He was describing, with considerable accuracy, the neurological state that sustained unpredictable threat induces in the human brain. He had reached a state where the cortical system's ability to direct behavior had been severely compromised by sustained subcortical activation. He had been, in clinical terms, effectively broken by artillery before any American soldier reached him. What Hayashi described was not unique to him. Across dozens of intelligence interviews with Japanese prisoners of war, the same elements appeared with remarkable consistency. The loss of the connection between action and perceived safety. The inability to maintain organized resistance not because of fear of death specifically, but because of the disruption of the cognitive processes that organized behavior requires. The sense that the artillery followed them, found them, was aware of them as individuals in a way that felt personal rather than statistical. That last element deserves attention. Multiple Japanese prisoners described American artillery as feeling personal, as feeling targeted at them specifically. This was not entirely irrational. Forward observers were watching and adjusting fires based on observed movement. When a soldier moved and artillery moved with him, the experience of being personally tracked was, in a limited sense, accurate. An observer had seen him move. The observer had communicated that movement to the fire direction center. Fire had been adjusted in response. The technology of the forward observer system created an experience of being individually hunted that no other weapon system of the period could replicate. Bombing was area destruction. Naval gunfire was area destruction. Flamethrowers killed whoever was in the bunker. Artillery could follow an individual soldier across a landscape. This experience of individual pursuit, of being specifically seen and specifically targeted, added a psychological dimension to the fear of artillery that amplified its effects beyond the physical danger it presented. The human brain is extraordinarily sensitive to the perception of being singled out as prey. The forward observer system, however unintentionally, activated this ancient terror with remarkable efficiency. The Battle of Okinawa, fought from April 1 through June 22, 1945, was the largest amphibious operation in the Pacific War and the bloodiest battle of the entire Pacific Campaign. American forces committed approximately 183,000 Army and Marine Corps troops. Japanese forces defending the island numbered approximately 100,000. Casualties on both sides exceeded anything previously seen in the Pacific. American casualties totaled approximately 12,000 killed and 36,000 wounded. Japanese military casualties exceeded 77,000 killed. Okinawan civilian casualties may have exceeded 100,000. American artillery fired more shells during the Battle of Okinawa than in any previous Pacific campaign. Artillery units attached to the 10th Army on Okinawa included Army and Marine Corps units equipped with 75 mm pack howitzers, 105 mm howitzers, 155 mm howitzers, and 8-inch howitzers. The 155 mm long tom guns, capable of firing a 95-pound shell to a range of more than 14 miles, gave American artillery a reach that could cover the entire island. The accumulated doctrine and technique of 4 years of Pacific combat came together on Okinawa in a form that represented the full maturation of American artillery as a psychological weapon. Forward observers had been refined through 4 years of experience into an extraordinarily capable corps. They knew how to call for fire quickly. They knew how to adjust accurately. They knew how to describe targets in terms that the Fire Direction Center could process and respond to in minimum time. They had developed, through hard combat experience, an instinctive understanding of how artillery fire patterns interacted with the terrain. The Fire Direction Center system had been perfected. Communication procedures were standardized. Computation procedures were standardized. The time from observer call to first-round impact had been reduced through accumulated practice to 60 to 90 seconds in favorable conditions. The ammunition was available in quantities that earlier campaigns had never seen. Resupply ships maintained adequate stocks throughout the campaign despite the extraordinary consumption rates. American artillery on Okinawa did not have to ration fire. It could sustain the weight of fire that the tactical situation demanded as long as the tactical situation required. And the terrain of Okinawa, unlike the coral flats of Tarawa or the jungle ridges of Bougainville, provided excellent observation for forward observers in many sectors. The island's rolling terrain, with its series of east-west ridge lines, gave American observers elevated positions from which they could watch Japanese movements across broad areas. The result was a campaign in which Japanese infantry, attempting to defend a series of prepared ridgeline positions, was subjected to a weight and accuracy of artillery fire that exceeded anything the Pacific War had previously produced. Lieutenant Masahide Oda served as an intelligence officer with the 32nd Japanese Army on Okinawa. He was one of the relatively few Japanese officers on Okinawa who survived the campaign. He did so partly through luck and partly through the extraordinary circumstances of the battle's final days, during which he became separated from his unit while attempting to reach the southern part of the island. He was captured in late June 1945 and was unusually cooperative with American intelligence, having concluded that Japanese resistance was futile and that cooperation might contribute to a faster end to the war. His account of artillery's effect on Japanese defensive operations on Okinawa is one of the most detailed available from the Japanese perspective. He said that the 32nd Army's defensive plan was well conceived and well executed in its initial stages. The Shuri Line, anchored on the ancient Shuri Castle and extending across the island's width, was the most formidable prepared defensive position the Japanese had constructed in the Pacific War. Multiple defensive lines in depth, interlocking fields of fire, tunnel systems allowing movement underground, artillery position to support infantry, pre-registered fires covering every likely avenue of approach. The position was designed to absorb American firepower and make the attack costly. In terms of time and casualties inflicted on American forces, it succeeded. The Shuri Line held from early April through late May 1945. But Oda said that from his observation, the artillery destroyed the 32nd Army not primarily through the casualties it inflicted on the fortified positions. It destroyed the 32nd Army through its effect on the units that had to operate in the open. He described the supply system. Japanese logistics on Okinawa required movement of supplies from rear areas to forward positions. This movement had to traverse open ground, or ground that appeared covered but could be observed from American positions on higher terrain. Every significant supply movement attracted artillery fire within minutes of observation. Within 2 weeks of the American landing, Japanese supply operations on Okinawa were in a state of serious degradation. Units in the forward lines were receiving a fraction of the ammunition, food, and water they required for sustained operations. The physical degradation this caused in Japanese defensive capacity compounded continuously as the campaign progressed. By late April, Oda said, he was observing Japanese infantry units that had been in the line for 3 weeks without adequate resupply. Men who were consuming perhaps half the calories required to maintain physical function. Men who had not received ammunition resupply for 4 or 5 days and were conserving what they had. Men who were dealing with wounded comrades without adequate medical supplies because the medical supplies could not be moved forward. He said the condition of these men was not primarily physical, though the physical deterioration was severe. It was the combination of physical degradation and sustained exposure to artillery that produced the psychological state he observed. A well-fed, well-rested soldier could maintain functional resistance under artillery fire for longer than a hungry, exhausted soldier who had been under fire for weeks. The interdiction of Japanese logistics by American artillery had created the conditions under which the psychological effects of artillery were most extreme. He described a counterattack ordered by 32nd Army Headquarters on April 12, 1945. A substantial portion of the 24th Infantry Division was committed to a daylight assault on American positions south of the Kakazu Ridge. Oda observed parts of the assault from a vantage point that gave him a broad view of the approach terrain. He said the assault was broken by artillery within the first 20 minutes. Not destroyed, broken. The units involved did not cease to exist. They dispersed. Men survived the initial fire missions and took cover in whatever terrain features were available. But when the artillery lifted and American infantry advanced, the Japanese units that should have reorganized and resumed the fight were not capable of doing so. Individual soldiers continued to fight. Small groups maintained resistance. But the formation that had advanced, the coordinated assault that Japanese doctrine required, had been destroyed as an organizational entity by 20 minutes of sustained American artillery fire. He said this was the essential difference between what artillery accomplished and what every other weapon accomplished. Other weapons killed soldiers. Artillery destroyed formations. American official histories of the Pacific War contain extensive data on artillery employment. Shell expenditures are recorded in the logs of artillery units, in after-action reports, in the quartermaster records that tracked ammunition supply and consumption. The numbers are large. During the Battle of Okinawa, American artillery fired approximately 2.5 million artillery rounds over the course of the 82-day campaign. That is roughly 30,000 rounds per day, expended from approximately 500 artillery pieces of various calibers. During the Battle of Iwo Jima, American artillery fired approximately 450,000 rounds during the 36-day campaign, averaging approximately 12,500 rounds per day from the island's available artillery. These numbers are large enough to be meaningless without context. But consider what 12,500 artillery rounds per day means in tactical terms on an island 8 square miles in size. An island 8 square miles in size contains approximately 20 million square meters of surface area. Divided among the Japanese defensive positions across the island, the concentration of artillery fire available was approximately 1 shell per 1,600 square meters per day from artillery alone, before accounting for naval gunfire, aerial bombing, or mortar fire. In the specific sectors where fighting was most intense, the concentration was far higher. Artillery was directed at identified targets and suspected positions, not distributed evenly across the island. In the central sectors around the Motoyama Plateau, where Japanese resistance was most concentrated, artillery densities approached 1 round per 100 square meters per day. But even these numbers, presented in this way, obscure the essential psychological truth. Artillery fire was not distributed evenly across time, came in bursts, in fire missions lasting minutes, concentrated on specific targets, delivering intense, sustained fire over short periods, then lifting, then beginning again. A Japanese soldier in a contested sector might experience no artillery fire for an hour, then 200 rounds landing in his immediate vicinity over the course of 5 minutes. The irregularity was as important as the volume. Predictable fire can be endured. Unpredictable fire cannot be habituated to. The nervous system cannot adapt to a threat it cannot anticipate. Each burst of artillery fire found the nervous systems of Japanese soldiers without warning, without preparation, activating the full subcortical stress response regardless of how many previous barrages they had survived. This is why Japanese veterans, looking back across decades at their combat experiences, consistently described artillery as the weapon they had feared most. Not because it killed the most men, though it may well have, but because it was the weapon that their minds could not accommodate. The weapon that found them in their deepest bunkers, in their most hidden tunnels, whenever duty or necessity or desperation drove them into the open. The weapon that followed their movements and found their supplies and destroyed their medical capacity and killed their commanders and made the simple act of being alive in daylight a statistically dangerous proposition. The weapon they could not escape, could not endure, could not overcome through spirit or training or the fierce determination that had carried Japanese infantry through a decade of warfare. Hachiro Takeda was 72 years old when he agreed to be interviewed for a Japanese documentary about the Pacific War. He had been a corporal in the 1st Infantry Regiment during the fighting on Saipan in 1944. He had survived the campaign through a combination of circumstances that included being wounded in the first week of fighting and spending several days in a cave with other wounded men, largely out of the direct combat zone. He had watched the final banzai charge of July 7, 1944, from a distance. He had watched several hundred Japanese soldiers, many of them wounded, advance across open ground toward American lines in a final act of organized resistance. He had watched American artillery and machine gun fire meet them in the open. He was quiet for a long time after describing that. Then he said something that his interviewer recorded, and that was included in the documentary. He said that in the many years since the war, he had tried to understand why the artillery had affected him in the specific way it had. He was an educated man. He had read books about psychology and about the physiology of stress. He had come to understand, at least intellectually, some of the mechanisms that made sustained artillery fire so psychologically devastating. But he said that understanding the mechanism had not made the memory less difficult to carry. He said that 50 years after the battle, he still could not hear a loud, sudden, unexpected noise without a physical reaction he could not control. He said that the reaction was instantaneous and involuntary, before his conscious mind had time to register that the noise was harmless. His body had already responded as if it were a shell landing. He said this was, in a strange way, evidence for everything he had been trying to describe, because the reaction had persisted for 50 years without diminishing significantly. Because whatever the artillery had done to the connection between sensory input and physical response in 1944, it had done it with such thoroughness that half a century of peaceful life had not undone it. He was describing, with the accuracy of personal experience, the persistent neurological effects of acute stress response, the long-term modification of sensory processing pathways that combat stress can produce. What would later be diagnosed and treated as post-traumatic stress disorder, then called something else, then not called anything at all. He was describing, in other words, a weapon that had reached inside the human nervous system and made a change that lasted a lifetime. Sergeant Raymond Hart, who had fought at Iwo Jima with the 4th Marine Division and who had watched flamethrower teams clear Japanese bunkers in February 1945, had also watched American artillery work across the open terrain of the island. He told interviewers late in his life that the flamethrowers had been more viscerally dramatic. You could see what they did. You could watch the fire go in and watch the defenders come out. There was a clarity to it, a visible cause and visible effect, that artillery lacked. But when he was asked which weapon had done more to determine the battle's outcome, he was thoughtful. He said that the flamethrowers cleared the positions you could find and reach. But there were positions he never reached, bunkers that American infantry never got close enough to burn, defensive works that stayed intact until Japanese units inside them chose to abandon them or died of other causes. He said the positions those units abandoned, they usually abandoned because the supply situation had become untenable, because American artillery had made the movement of supplies impossible, because the men inside had been without water long enough that remaining in the fortification was as lethal as leaving it. He said the artillery did things you couldn't see. It worked on logistics and on the mind in ways that didn't produce dramatic visible results in the way a flamethrower attack did. But when he thought about the cumulative effect of 4 weeks of fighting on an island 8 miles square, he thought the artillery had done more to win the battle than any other single factor. He said this carefully. He was not discounting the flamethrowers or the tanks or the infantry courage that had moved forward into Japanese fire every single day. All of it mattered. All of it was necessary. But the artillery had created the conditions in which everything else was possible. It had constrained Japanese movement, degraded Japanese supply, disrupted Japanese command and control, and broken the psychological capacity of Japanese infantry to sustain organized resistance across the duration of a 36-day battle. The flamethrowers cleared the positions you could see. The artillery destroyed the army that defended them. There are approximately 200,000 Japanese men who survived the Pacific War as combat veterans. By the time serious efforts were made to interview them systematically, in the 1970s and 1980s and into the 1990s, many were elderly. Many were reluctant to speak. The cultural weight of the defeat and of the atrocities committed by Japanese forces made public discussion of combat experience extraordinarily difficult for that generation. But those who did speak, who found the words to describe what they had experienced, returned again and again to the same themes. The immensity of American firepower, the impossibility of movement in daylight, the feeling of being watched from every direction, the progressive degradation of the capacity to think clearly, to plan, to act with purpose. And most consistently, most persistently, across accounts from Guadalcanal and Tarawa and Bougainville and Saipan and Peleliu and Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the artillery. Not the bombs, whose arrival could be at least partially anticipated and which ended when the aircraft departed. Not the naval guns, which fired in patterns and at intervals that experienced soldiers learned to read. Not the flamethrowers, which were terrible and close and personal but which required human operators who could be killed, whose fuel could be exhausted, who had to close to within 40 yards to do their work. The artillery followed them everywhere. The artillery found them in their best prepared positions and their most carefully concealed movements. The artillery was always there, always available, always ready to respond to the radio call of an observer who had seen them move. A flamethrower could empty its tanks. An artillery barrage had no end that a soldier in the target zone could perceive or predict. It stopped when the Americans chose to stop it. It resumed when the Americans chose to resume it. It was a demonstration of will and capacity so overwhelming, so persistent, so apparently inexhaustible, that it communicated something beyond the immediate physical danger. It communicated the scale of what Japanese soldiers were attempting to resist. And across the 4 years of the Pacific War, that communication, delivered in fire and concussion and the tearing sound of shells overhead, had its effect. Not instantly, not easily. Japanese soldiers resisted with a courage and tenacity that their American opponents consistently acknowledged and respected. They held positions longer than seemed humanly possible. They mounted counterattacks under conditions that should have made organized resistance impossible. They demonstrated, repeatedly and conclusively, that the human capacity to endure is larger than any armchair assessment can measure. But they could not endure it indefinitely. No one could. No one can. The artillery that broke Japanese infantry across the Pacific Islands was not a sophisticated or subtle weapon. It was, at its core, an industrial achievement. American factories produced more shells than Japanese soldiers could absorb. American logistics delivered those shells to wherever American guns were positioned. American doctrine concentrated those shells on identified targets with an efficiency and speed that Japanese soldiers had no answer for. And the forward observers who called the fires, the young officers and NCOs with radios who moved with the infantry and watched and adjusted and called again, they connected that industrial achievement to the specific human beings trying to resist it. They turned the output of American industry into a personal encounter. They made the artillery follow you. The men who survived the experience never forgot what it felt like. The men who did not survive it never had to. If you found this story compelling, please consider subscribing to stay connected with these histories. Each one matters. Each one reveals something important about the nature of warfare and the men who fought it. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We read every one. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.